I would like to welcome all of you to this very special event, a conversation between two friends and two very, very prominent scholars and very influential thinkers, and Islam, human rights, and the secular. Some of you were here yesterday at Talal Asad's lecture on reflections on the origins of human rights. So there will be a sense of a continuation of the conversation, but today we are expanding it to broader topics. Both really need no introduction. Both are very distinguished scholars, distinguished professor of anthropology at CUNY, at the Graduate Center in New York City, and Professor An-Naim, a distinguished professor of law at the School of Law at Emory University. Both of them have written very influential books precisely on topics of Islam, the secular, religion, human rights. It's almost 20 years ago that Talal Asad gave here in this very room the very influential lecture on anthropology of Islam, which forced everybody to rethink the way in which we talk about Islam, particularly to question any kind of essentializing Islam. To a certain extent, the project of Professor An-Naim is directly related to this. But since then, Professor Talal Asad has also challenged our way of thinking about religion. His critique of Clifford Geertz's abstract historical concept of religion has been extremely influential in religious studies, in a discourse on religion. And this was expanded into the well-known book, Genealogies of Religion. And later, it was about 10 years ago, that Talal Asad basically forced us to rethink something that we had never thought, or we took for granted, namely the secular. His call for an anthropology of the secular was the first call anybody had given, and I think that there has been a completely new program of research around the world, which is very much related to this call by Talal Asad. Professor Naim has dedicated much of his scholarly work to rethink the issues of Islam and human rights towards a Muslim or Islamic reformation, and has written on constitutionalism, Sharia, and particularly his book, Islam and the Secular State, Negotiating the Future of Sharia, has been a very, very important work. The structure of our conversation is going to be Talal is going to begin with a short statement, a 10-minute, followed by a statement by Abdullahi An-Naim, and then we'll begin the conversation. I'll try to mediate the conversation, sometimes trying to be a little provocative, because although their positions are sufficiently distant at some points, they're very close friends, and they may not fully be ready to criticize each other. So because I'm also a good friend of both of them, I take the liberty to push them a little. So, Talal, please.
It's on now, yes, and everybody can hear me. Well, what I was told was, first of all, I'm only going to speak for about 10 minutes, was thank you very much, Jose. As usual, you are such a wonderful host and have given such a fine introduction to us both. But Jose suggested that I should talk a little bit, first of all, about some of the main points from yesterday's lecture, which was an exploration of a number of concepts that seem to me to lie at the origin of human rights, which is part of something I'm thinking about for my next book. But if I could just summarize, first of all, some things from that lecture, then I will try and make some points about Professor Abdullahi's work, particularly his famous book, which has been much more influential than mine. Mine is purely academic, you know, and this is where the real effect of politics and so on comes. And also to raise in the course of it, first of all, the things that I think are terrific about it. And then some thoughts I had about questions which would be good to have you answer. And then finally, I'll say a few words about the question of the actual politics. It'll be very brief to begin with, of trying to move some of our countries towards a more democratic form of politics and government and so on, which is not always the same thing as the theorization of what one would like to see and how one would like to see it. Anyway, so let me begin. I really basically tried to stress a couple of things yesterday, and perhaps I should focus on the most important ones. First of all, that the emotions that we talk about, like compassion and sympathy, which are supposed to lie at the base of human rights, are really much more mobile, much more unpredictable, much more uncontrollable than one thinks. They are both necessary and dangerous, one might say. And they are not, I think, to be very closely connected to and essentially connected to the whole question of rights. In my view, rights, whatever their value, should have a certain kind of separation and often may come before emotions themselves, may indeed lead to certain emotions rather than be based on certain emotions. Anyway, this is a matter that I would like us to think about more. The other point that I tried to make was that there are problems, in my view, with human rights. And I have to always explain to people that while I am by no means, as it were, an opponent of the idea of human rights, it seems to me that one has to be very careful not to place, as it were, invest too much of our hopes in it for a number of reasons. And perhaps the most important reason has to do with the fact that it is addressed to and linked necessarily to a regime of law which ultimately is invested in the state, the modern state. And the modern state, as well as some of its allies like the corporations, international corporations, are, in my view, not only not to be trusted, but do actually use human rights for their own purposes. So, on the one hand, human rights is in this curious situation of being a claim to universality, and paradoxically, it is vested in a state, and within the state in certain interests, and also, of course, with international corporations and so on. So it serves particular issues, either of national interest or of economic interest for the profit of particular corporations and so on. So the paradox seems to me that this claim to universality is linked to a reality of particularity. And I'm not absolutely sure how we get out of it, but certainly this is something one should be more aware of, I think, than we sometimes are. The other thing, of course, is one which plagues the whole issue, which I'm sure all of us have come across again and again and again, and that is, since human rights are, in fact, invested in states which have their national interests, they are also attached to interests of the great powers. And, I have only to raise the question, who would dare, apart from sort of making wild shouts in the back streets at night about the United States, who would dare to bring the United States or any of its for example, government people to justice for having violated human rights? And the United States and its allies also are therefore protected from it. So, and it's not just a matter of the move from an ideal, but unfortunately, it is the way in which human rights is constantly inserted into power politics and the power politics of states. And that is something that worries me and what I was partly talking about. Now, I come now again briefly to Abdullahi's excellent book. I must say, when I read it, I was both enormously stimulated and full of admiration for what he's attempting to do, things which I'm sure he can more than adequately answer. We haven't had a chance actually to talk about the book yet, so I'm grateful to you for this occasion and for his clarification. There are so many good things about it. I mean, I think the kind of world one would like to see, that Abdullahi would like to see, and I would also support and like to see, are not very far apart, in fact, and our concern of the way in which intolerance has become a form that is often given, if you like, a religious cloak, is something that disturbs us all. Nevertheless, and there are other good things which I like to be more specific about his book, and I want to mention some of these. I think that the idea of separating political authority from spirituality or religion, I have, as you know, problems with even the definition, but I'll come to that because it has an interest in this argument, I think. But nevertheless, I can see one point that you want to make there, and I think it's important, but it does raise, in my mind, certain questions, certain problems. It's not that it's impossible, but that, in fact, it requires, I think, further elaboration. The possibility of rethinking Islamic political thought, and indeed even rethinking the Sharia, seems to me to be very important. And there I'm in complete agreement with you. And I believe that this is something which is already beginning to happen in various ways, even within the Middle East itself. The possibility that certain aspects of what people immediately think of as the Sharia can be changed actually has already been done, as we know. If you think about the abolition of slavery, which used to be taken for granted even in the Sharia in the Middle Ages, there is now no country, no Muslim country, which officially accepts slavery. And this has had to be rethought, and this has had to be conceded as something which goes against, as it were, moral bases. But there is a more general point, and I think it's an interesting point, and that is clearly the Sharia itself may have certain problems about about principles that may conflict with the notion of human rights, particularly the notion of equality, for example. We know that although there are many, many good things about the Sharia, and by the way, I liked your reference to the fact that people think that somehow the Sharia is virtually, nothing but stoning adulteresses and cutting off hands, whereas in fact there's a lot in the Sharia which is consistent with many of the principles of human rights. Nevertheless, there is something also about the Sharia which ought, in my view, also to be further explored, and I don't know whether you would agree with that, and that's beyond the question of maqasid, the question of ahliyat al-wujub, that is of a certain legal capacity, which in an important sense all persons, according to the Sharia, have. There is a kind of universal acceptance, and this is truly a universal principle, if you like. and that is that everybody, even those who are unequal, even men and women who have had conventionally and traditionally inequality, nevertheless they each have a certain legal capacity and certain, if you like, inalienable rights. They may not be equal rights in the way in which human rights thinks of them, but nevertheless they are rights. And even now that we don't have slaves, but even slaves had certain rights, and a master had to abide by those rights. And I think this is something which needs to, we could think a little more about. But so there are various ways, and I do agree completely with you about the need for rethinking, and there are so many different questions that arise in that context, which I'm sure you want to expand on. But the separation of politics and, or rather, a separation of the state and politics, state and religion, but not of religion and politics, as you point out. And that's interesting. And in a way, it seems to me suggestive to make it possible for religious principles, religious beliefs, to come into the public sphere. But is it so easy, this is one of my questions, to separate off politics from the state? If you think about even our lobby system here in the United States, and the fact that it's not only the electoral system which gets elects our Congress and therefore representatives, it is also a lobby system. And of course there are special interests. And this is part of the way, as I hardly need to tell you now, in the middle of all these debates about healthcare system and so on. Is it really possible to separate off the way in which the state operates, or at least the legislative body, which is the most important part of it, and that is Congress, and politics, and that is special interests, which interfere with them, whether they are religious or they are secular, whether they are communal or whatever. It's difficult to separate these out. Just as it's difficult also, I think, and I'd like to hear you on this, really to separate out religion from the state. Because the state has to, and this is of course the quandary, the state has to define what is essentially religion in order to be able to protect it, even if you have freedom of religion. The state has to decide what is to be protected. Therefore, that part of it can't be separated out. The state will have to, in some way or other, take upon itself the right to decide. And historically, what's been very interesting is, of course, that this has shifted the way in which people have come to regard what is essentially religion, and people have come to also support or to dismiss what is essentially religion. And these are problems that are with us, and I can't see how they can be got over it. And I'd like to recommend a book which some of you may already know, and I don't know, Abdullahi, whether you know it yourself, by Winifred Sullivan. You know that book? Yes. Called The Impossibility of Religious Freedom, by a professor who is both a trained anthropologist and a trained lawyer. In fact, in one of the sort of SUNY campuses, I can't remember which now. In where? Buffalo, right. And it's really a marvelous book. And it leaves us with a quandary. My question really is to push you into being more uncomfortable than you might otherwise be about the formulae that you have in the book. That's one part of it, and I would like you to comment on that. Finally, I'd like to say that really one has to pay more attention, I think, to what is actually going on in Muslim countries, in the Middle East or in other parts of the Muslim world, about which I know less perhaps. And there are many of the people who are actually struggling for a greater opening and a greater possibility for public debate, argument, democratic representation, and so on, I think should not be labeled, as they often are quite so easily, as Islamists, and therefore committed to a certain kind of political order. One of the things one I think is sometimes somewhat unfair, if you like, intellectually unfair, is to imagine that all of us learn from experience, but somehow people whom we call Islamists, who don't, of course, call themselves usually Islamists, but as Muslims, but that they don't themselves learn from experience. And I think it's important to be able to judge when one thinks that this learning from experience is actually occurring in the politics of the countries with which we are familiar. I'm already done more than 10 minutes, which I shouldn't really do. So we'll talk again more, I'm sure, later on. So perhaps I should let you now talk, Abdullahi.
Okay. Thank you very much, Talal, and good evening, everybody. I would like to start with maybe a rejoinder to a theme that was in Talal's presentation last night. One of the questions he asked was, who is the human in human rights? And for me, it is a critical question, but I have a different answer to it. And the reason I start with this is that it will lead into all the other issues that we are going to talk about. To me, the human in human rights is a self-determining human. So the idea of self-determination is, for me, it is the essence of being human. And I speak as a Muslim, so it is for me as a Muslim, the ability and the right and the capacity to be self-determining is really at the core of my humanity. And it is very much in exercising that humanity and self-determination that I will go to challenge the difficulties and the struggle for the notion of human rights as I see it. And to me, it is not a state-centric idea. It is a people-centered idea. That yes, we need the state, but we don't depend on the state to protect our human rights. We need to make the state protect our human rights. And so the point I'm here trying to start with is to say that the self-determination of the human is really the core and the hope, because it is human beings who make states do what they do or fail to do what they do. States are not entities that can do anything. They are institutions. They are organs. They are structures. It is the people who run the state and the people who are subjects of the state or citizens of the state who make the state do what it does or fail to do what it does. So therefore, I cannot afford to give up on the possibility of transforming the state, of challenging the state, of holding the state accountable. And I count for that on the self-determination of the human subject of human rights. So I like the idea of paradox. I find the notion of paradox very creative, precisely because it gave us a chance to mediate what might otherwise look to be a dead end or a sort of a blocked situation. When, yes, I need the state, but I cannot trust the state, or that the structures of human rights have to be to use the instrumentality of the state, but the states are pursuing their own interests. So those types of quandaries and difficulties, I find the idea of paradox to be helpful. And I do speak of two types of paradox. I call it the paradox of universality and the paradox of self-regulation by the state. That granted, they are both paradoxes, but they are both paradoxes that we need to mediate. We cannot afford to live alone or just simply to give up and throw our hands and say, okay, it can't be helped. And of course, I'm not going to the universality paradox, but on the state side, Talal now just asked the question, who would dare hold the United States accountable or challenge? The citizens of the United States dare and must and can and have. And I think if we look at the difference between this administration and the previous administration, we understand how. So it is not that other states have to hold the United States accountable, that it is so long as someone can and someone does, and that someone is the citizen of this country. And it is the citizen of every country who has to do what it takes to make their states respond to their demands and expectations about human rights. So fortunately, there is that who can dare, and there is that who can make a difference, and that person is here, right among us. We are it. And I think everywhere that is the case. Again, it goes to that notion of self-determining human. And last night also there was some notion of pessimism. Someone was saying that Talal ended on a pessimist note. I call myself a pragmatic optimist. And I think the pragmatic part is what makes Talal pessimist. That is the realities of power and power relations and greed and the ambiguity of the emotions that he was talking about. But for me, optimism is a strategy. It is a survival strategy. I cannot afford not to be optimistic. Because basically, what else can I do if I give up on the possibility of transformation and change? Moving on to, again, not to take too long, but again, trying to respond to Talal's specific points about the book, Islam and the Secular State, and about the question of Sharia. The example he gave is very instructive, actually, because slavery was abolished in the Muslim world by secular law, not by Sharia, not by a change in Sharia. And if you continue to adhere to the classical concepts of the usul al-fiqh, that is the science or the methodology of extrapolating specific principles from the sources of Quran and Sunnah, you cannot abolish slavery as a matter of Sharia. Because its foundations exist in the sources and the methodology that the sources were developed through. It happened to be simply stopped by secular regimes, secular laws, and now it is going to be challenging to restart it. But the point actually is interesting that we have a class here, we call it the future of Islamic law, which was yesterday. In our yesterday class, the question of slavery came up also. And the point I made is that if you can imagine the circumstances that enable the slavery to be in Sharia terms, it can be reestablished. Because if the requirement that Sharia had for how slavery and slaves are to be acquired and are to be dealt with, it can happen again. So I think what we have through secular developments is a chance to distance ourselves from an abhorrent institution that none of us is now in a position to defend morally or willing to defend morally. But that should not simply be left at that point just to say, okay, alhamdulillah, thank God, we no longer have slavery. The question is that we have to confront ourselves with the paradox and the absurdity and the moral untenability of the fact that something like slavery is still valid from a Sharia point of view, although it has been superseded by secular law and secular practice in this regard. And that's why it sort of, as I think the expression goes, to put our feet to the fire, that is to keep pushing ourselves to say we cannot just simply rely on the fact that something like secular institutions overcome a Sharia principle and we live happily ever after as if nothing is wrong with what our understanding of Sharia is. So it is, the rethinking of Sharia is absolutely critical, but it has to be methodological. It cannot be selective. That is, we cannot just simply pick and choose verses or sources that we find to be amenable to what we think would like Sharia to be without confronting the others which are not so helpful. And so the question has to be very much a question of challenging the paradigm itself as a human paradigm, not as a divine. Sharia is not divine. Sharia is a human understanding of the divine, but itself is not a divine institution or concept. The idea of legal capacity that Talal mentioned, which, for example, in Abu Hanifa, the notion of Adami, that is the human, in fact, is a universalizing idea or a universalist idea. But it is sort of ambiguous because of the other specific aspects. So the essence of the humanity is there, but it is not expansive enough, it is not robust enough to really give us a human rights discourse or a human rights paradigm as we need it to have it today. So maybe we can draw on something like Adami, the notion of the human in Abu Hanifa's work, as a precursor for what our thinking might be like, but we cannot stop at that because he was bound by the structures of usul al-fiqh that we cannot afford to stay with. So going to the paradox about, again, to move on, the paradox of separation of religion and the state and the connectedness of religion and politics. And interestingly, the reason I'm presenting sort of the connectedness as a vehicle for very much addressing the question about the Islamists that Talal ended with. Because I take the humanity of every human being seriously. I cannot exclude any human from any activity that is critical to being human, including the right to be politically active and engaged and to have a stake in the institutions of the state and institutions of society. So the connectedness of religion and politics is to open the possibility exactly for the sort of transformation and pragmatic change that can happen among even the most extreme or sort of conservative elements. Unfortunately, we always have to have some sort of way of describing what we are talking about. So if they are not Islamists, what are they? So can we find a way that we can talk about what we are talking about? So my sense is that the connectedness of religion and politics is to be acknowledged in order to create the space for every type of discourse to be possible within certain parameters, because the parameters are needed for that discourse itself to happen. And those are human rights, constitutionalism, and citizenship. Those are the parameters that I propose in the book. So that I need that framework for civic reason, what I call civic reason, to happen, so that Islamists can be part of the political process without being able to take it over or to completely hijack it. But ultimately, how that happens is up to me and other citizens to say, no, this is not sort of thing that you can have. And the idea of paradox, to conclude also, I take it to the inherent political nature of the state, and yet the need to keep the state as at least political as possible. And the example I give actually in this town may be quite appropriate to recall here. I give the example of what happened in the Justice Department during the Bush administration. For me, the state is the institutional continuity of sovereignty of the people. So it is, the Justice Department is the state. The Attorney General is a political functionary who represents politics, who represents the government. So the idea is that the state institution must have a continuity that Gonzalez can use it to fulfill the mandate that his president had at the time, and Holder now can use it to fulfill the mandate his president now has at this time. So the element of continuity of the institution of the Justice Department is what the state, it is political, almost everything is political, but it is political in a different way than the government of the day, than the politics of the day. And when Gonzalez abused that authority by firing the federal prosecutors for political reasons, that was a disruption of the integrity of the institution of the Justice Department. And rightly, he was forced out of office. And that's an example of what I say when I say that the citizens of the United States are those who dare and do hold the United States government and the state itself accountable. So it is, to conclude, to say that I completely granted that I don't think that any theorization is going, or theorizing is ever going to resolve all questions. Nothing human is going to be perfect or going to be complete. But I think it is just a question of mediating paradoxes enough to create the space for people to act and exercise their self-determination, and in the process protect their own human rights, and how that is how I think the process continues.
You've mentioned what your position has been one state-centric conception of human rights. He's proposing, I'm not sure, society-centric or actually human-centric. It's okay. Your reply. And let me add something, yes, in question of context. Yesterday in the conversation, it came and you gave, the problem is not so much when, in which context is it proper to use the discourse of human rights, when not. And you gave us an example, Martin Luther King's decision not to use so much the discourse of human rights is a different kind of discourse, right? Now, from a different context, let's say, myself personally, coming from Spain, the Franco-authoritarian regime, the way in which under certain contexts, the discourse of human rights can be precisely used to contest a state-centric situation, and the way in which then the incorporation of this discourse by the Catholic Church around the globe, to a certain extent, did change the authoritarian politics of Catholic countries everywhere, and bring and lead some slightly more democratic forms of politics in many Catholic countries. Now, obviously, this is part of global processes, but to a simply notion that we have a state-centric regimes of human rights versus the possibility of using human rights to challenge a state authority or a state structures, which I assume it goes more in the sense in which Abdullahi is bringing it. So,
well, I would hope that since you've had an opportunity to talk together, you have more of a common perspective on this. No, I wouldn't say, ever that it is not useful. But if you take the example you've yourself given about the Justice Department, I don't remember at any point in the struggle human rights being invoked, the language of human rights. It was against the law, and therefore, against the integrity of the Justice Department. A whole series of challenges can be and have been mounted by both members of Congress or people outside, members of parties or social movements, political movements. But they don't necessarily, in this country, they haven't very often, very, very rarely, I would say, but in fact more positively, have they invoked human rights. That was my point. My point was not that human rights is never usable in any situation in order to improve matters. In fact, the democratization the example I gave yesterday, I think, was of England itself, over several centuries, took place as a result of various struggles, partly class struggles, partly members of the elite and so on, who were very much concerned with reform and so forth, and were concerned to concede and so on. But the point is that this was not a language. I am not suggesting, therefore, that the language of human rights is never usable for any strategic purpose. What I would like to hear more from both of you, if you like, since you've emphasized that point, is in what way one should emphasize everything or translate everything into human rights as such, when in fact that's not what happens. In fact, there are other languages which are rich. It was not, by the way, I think, as far as I know, that Malcolm X actually decided. He said, no, I'm not going to use human rights, I'm going to use something else. No, it came quite naturally to him to use, talk about democracy, to talk about American democracy, to use a Christian vocabulary also at various points and so on. And as I said yesterday, and I would say again today, this had a tremendous purchase in the United States. And the one person, the example I gave yesterday was Malcolm X, who did try to use the language of human rights and talked about it in that context, didn't at that time have that kind of purchase. Now, I was told yesterday that in fact something came out of that, and I'm ignorant of it and would be grateful for more details on that subject, fair enough. But this is interesting. I'm suggesting that maybe we can look at different kinds of languages that are available, that seem at first sight not to be legal languages, legalistic languages, which is not to exclude, as it were, the possibilities that are available to the use of human rights. I started off by emphasizing that it's possible, indeed it's very important sometimes, to have laws, and I'll say laws rather than human rights here at this point, as indeed is the case in, as everybody knows, in the United States. It was important to break apartheid is what I'm wrongly thinking about, but segregation in the South, in order to also break attitudes, break emotions, break feelings. And the law is sometimes necessary, very often necessary, in order to create that. And I have no argument against that. My argument is simply, well, on the one hand, to translate everything into human rights, and to say that you expect that somehow everybody will be in a position to invoke that effectively. And I don't think that happens. I don't think either in this country, if people are, of course people are protesting. Of course they have been protesting about the war. It wasn't very effective, of course, but nevertheless, it was it was quite a powerful thing. They have since then been campaigning on all sorts of things. They were very effective at grassroots level, as we know, in the election of the present president, and so on. Of course, this is in that sense a very vibrant democracy. But there is a connection I can see between human rights and democracy, and indeed human rights as a total regime, as it were, not just the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, but with all the other, the other covenants and treaties and so on that people subscribe to, have a connection with democracy. But in that, democracy is the language of democracy has not been immediately hitched to that of human rights, to that kind of thing. So that's my only
but
point.
I don't see who is saying that everything has to be in human rights terms, or who is saying no. I don't say that, and in fact, I don't think that human rights activists even would say that. I mean that human rights is one of the discourses we need. It is not the only discourse we need, and it is not appropriate everywhere all the time. And of course, like with everything else, there are some human rights fundamentalists, as there are secular fundamentalists, as there are religious fundamentalists. But the point is, I think if Talal's concern is that the language of human rights is not appropriate, constant, always, everywhere, for every context, absolutely true. In fact, it's a means to an end. Nothing is an end in itself, including human rights, including everything, including Islam, including the Quran. The human is the end of all means, but nothing else is an end. So my point is that I need to keep the discourse of human rights and the idea alive and vibrant and legitimate in different settings, because it is a language that can connect us globally. But every time human rights is realized, it is realized within a national context through constitutional and legal and political means locally. So the human rights do not materialize in sort of suspended animation up there in the abstraction. And again, it is about inspiring people. It's about also solidarity that people can create and nurture among themselves in order to create networks. It is a language that it is true that, by the way, it's often the term civil rights is used as if it is synonymous with human rights. And it is not, because civil rights are the rights of the citizen, whereas human rights are the rights of the human. And the dialectic and dynamic and contestation between the limitations of citizenship, or rather of universal human rights in national context, is what we need to challenge. But there is a healthy relationship there. So the point is that in that sense, the American Declaration of Independence was not a human rights document. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was not a human rights document. There was no human rights documents until the Universal Declaration of 1948. Because all of those documents were about the rights of citizens, not of the rights of the human. Now, Americans, with all due respect, are particularly chauvinistic and tendency to be exceptionalist, and it comes with power. It is not because they are American. It is because they can get away with it most of the time, or so it seems. And the point, when I emphasize the responsibility of American citizens, the point is to say that when you are powerful and you feel that you have a good system working for you, you don't need to be part of a bigger system of the universal human rights. I think that's very short-sighted and very dangerous and unbecoming of really a civilized nation. That the idea that what happens to other people is immaterial to you because you have it good in your home country and you have your institutions and your political process, that is not good enough. So in a way, to challenge, to say, actually, you do need this, even if in terms of your own national system and your own political and democratic system, things seem to be going well. Because there is a global interconnectedness of the human everywhere and so on. So not to belabor the point, but granted, I am, for one, I'm not saying that human rights discourse is to be constantly, always, and everywhere to be used. Absolutely not. But there are situations where only that discourse will be effective. And there are situations where other discourses will be effective.
If I may link, this brings to this notion of global interconnectedness and the way in which the human, as a category of solidarity, sympathy, can somehow build consensus, brings to the paradox that you, Talal, mentioned of universality being always particular, and the contesting claims of competing universalism. To a certain extent, these are the competing claims, of course, of all so-called world religions, right? All of them claiming to be both true and universal. And there is a competing claim, of course, of a kind of a secular reason that competes and presents its own universalism. Let's call it cosmopolitan universalism. In a certain sense, the recognition of this paradox, that indeed every universalism is particularistic, one could say is one of the reasons why the attempt to create this kind of discourse of the human may have this effect of linking this particular universalism. But of course, as you pointed out, the question is the effects of all these discourses everywhere. So the fact that the intentions may be global solidarity, of course, the effects may be different. And you mentioned in the abolition of slavery, of course, we know the role of evangelicals like Wilberforce, but we know that they also had a role in the whole missionizing, colonizing project in India. And you mentioned Bartolomé de las Casas and the fact that the very same person who, of course, in order to protect the Indians from slavery, proposed the enslavement of Africans. So there are always, history comes with these paradoxes. But of course, this doesn't mean that we cannot try to bridge these particularistic universalisms in our present context. So I want you to address this issue of the competing particular universalisms and the kind of almost universalization of particularisms also as kind of almost universal right. Well, it's a comment that...
no, it's a comment that, yeah, I think it's a comment we take.
If you are ready, you can begin, Talal, you, Abdu, and then Talal.
Yeah, if I may, on the universality question, I mean, there is no such thing as a universal human. Being human is being specific, is being of location, of context, of gender, of class, of all sorts of specifics about the human. So it is not an idea that, and by the way, there is a universalizing, or what we call imperialist universalism, which projects its relativity into the global sphere, to say that, like the American notion of freedom, the American law or American institution of international religious freedom, which is exclusive and American idea. How can it be international and American so that Americans define what freedom of religion is for everybody else and go out and impose sanctions unless the president exempt a country like Saudi Arabia from the sanctions because of other reasons? So the hypocrisy and the double standards are very serious. But that is what we need to expose and we need to confront. Now, the idea of universality is not something to proclaim, is not something to discover. It is something to construct. That is, I believe in constructing a universal, what I call overlapping consensus, using Raoul's idea, of our particularities. So that every human being is relativist by virtue of being human. She or he is of a place and a time and a culture and a set of values and so on. But can we come to a shared understanding of what human rights are, despite our differences as to why we come to that commitment? So it is not a notion of the universal being ready-made to be either brought down from natural law or proclaimed from the State Department, but it is about joining hands, joining struggles, in discourse, in an actual sort of solidarities. And yes, last night, as Talal mentioned, truly, solidarity can be very dangerous and very seductive and opportunistic and all of that. Yes, that is what human is. We are all sorts of things. Not always good, not always bad, but we have somehow to make sense of that. So solidarity as an idea can be hijacked, can be co-opted, yes. Human rights as an idea can be hijacked, can be co-opted, yes. But that is not good enough reason to give up on it. In fact, the very hijacking of the idea is a testimony to its power. Because if it is not, as Louis Henkin used to say, human rights and the double standards and the hypocrisy in human rights is the complement of vice to virtue. It is because it is attractive and because it is powerful, corporations would like to use it, governments or states would like to use it, but we need it more, and we cannot give up on it because others would like to use it.
I think, again, I'm not sure that there is too much disagreement. Perhaps I'm a little worried about too much confidence. That's
sure.
the main thing.
Yeah.
However, I want to ask you two questions and also to make one comment. First of all, it's not just the idea, this is my comment, of human rights as I see it, but there is an increasing materiality of laws, of cases. So when corporations use they don't just say human rights is a flag. You know, there are particular rules and regulations and cases and so on that they can go in and out. That's why they need lawyers for all this, because you and I wouldn't be able to understand it immediately, and why certain kinds of cases can have this outcome or that outcome and so on. So we have already an increasing body of law through which we decide, or people decide, or the courts decide, what is acceptable or compatible with human rights or not. And then you have also this distinction, between soft law and hard law, where to some extent hard law means having some kind of sanctions involved. Soft law is more a matter of influence and trying to get people to be a little more responsible towards human rights principles and so on and so forth. There is now an enormous raft, and I'm not an expert on this at all, and don't want to use up the remaining years of my life trying to understand that part of it. But I think it isn't enough just to keep, waving the flag of we need human rights. Yeah, okay, different things are possible in different situations. That's fine. But there seems to me to be a kind of excessive, I might almost say sort of religious, as many people have said, excitement about a solution which is special. I know you've said that it's not appropriate in every way, but you do believe that it is in some sense special to the transformation of the world. That leads me to my other question to you. And it's a real question, and it's not intended to be a trap or a thing. You say you have to construct universality. Mm-hmm. What kind of universe? What is the universe that you want to construct? Don't say human, because that already is circular. Mm-hmm. Because in fact, human has gradually, as I suggested very briefly yesterday, has itself changed its shape and content over historically, and can again, with all sorts of technological developments and genetic developments that are now available to us. Be careful. The human can be almost anything. Mm-hmm. So this is something at least we should think about. So what is to construct the universe, the universal? There is a universe. What is the universe? Logically, what is the universe to be constructed and politically?
On the last question, it is not about constructing a universe or the universe.
No, I don't mean,
Yeah, but it is about promoting a shared understanding of what it is to be human and what is due to a human by virtue of their humanity. A shared understanding. That's all. But then you see, then you go on and move to say, why do we need that shared understanding? So that we can create solidarity and partnership and engage in joint struggles despite our different locations, our different relative strengths and weakness, so that we have a vehicle for promoting this shared vision of the human. Human rights is not an end. Human rights is not special. I never say that. In fact, I often say there was a world before human rights, and there will be a world after human rights. So there is nothing special or nothing magical or nothing sort of transformative about human rights as such, no. To me, it is a means, it is a tool, it is a structure, a concept, ideas of laws and institutions that we can use to promote social justice and individual freedom. But if it doesn't serve that, then it is not worth having, and I don't care for it. So there is no magic to the term, there is no magic to the concept. It is a means to facilitate a struggle for justice, struggles for dignity. If it doesn't serve that end, by all means, it will die and it will go as many things have. I think also that when I said I am a pragmatic optimist, Meaning that I tend to see the half full part of the cup, not the half empty part. That if we look back, if we look forward or we look at our current situation, there is a lot to be desired. There is so much wrong with this and the other. But if you look back a little bit further, we will see that we have come some way at least. And that's part of my sense of optimism, to say that slavery was mentioned. Nobody today anywhere in the world would defend slavery. Until recently, unfortunately, nobody would defend torture. But the point is that it is not in the language of, not in the name or term of human rights. It is not in any particular institution or concept. It is the notion that human beings are getting to be more humane and more relative. I mean, if you look back and see how people used to deal with each other, and look now and see how we do, despite all what is wrong with the way we deal with each other today, I think it's an improvement from the way it used to be. I am an African. My country has been colonized by Britain. And now colonialism ended in some forms. Some people say it continues in other forms. But that is the nature of it. The nature is that there is never going to be a time, I'm a Muslim, I'm a believer, there is heaven, but it's never going to be on earth. To be here is by definition to live in contradiction, in struggles, in contestation, in limitations. And until we pass on, and hopefully those of us who make it, maybe there is heaven on the other side. But the point is that the nature of human experience is that it has these limitations. But so long as you are alive, we cannot afford to give up on what we can do about them. That's my point.
Briefly. We want to open the
Yeah,
floor.
quite. Perhaps this ought to also be a point which we might take up. Apart from that, which we could go on for a long time, I don't want to say I'm a pessimist and you're a pessimist. But can we think a little bit about how we can persuade people, or persuade the people who matter, much more importantly, to help or facilitate changes, say, in various parts of the Muslim world, or let's stick to the Middle East, with which we are both more familiar. How can we persuade them? What is necessary to persuade them? It's no good saying, you must, and it's a good thing, and let's be human, because they will say, yes, of course we are human. We have a conception of the human, and you will find that it's not the same as the one. So how do we do that?
That is why I think that's why we need a discourse that creates solidarity across boundaries about the state, cultural, and the labor movement and labor conditions is a very instructive example. I mean, in the early 20th century, that was exactly how do we persuade capitalists to grant humane living and working conditions for labor. But it doesn't come by persuasion in the sense of appealing to their good nature or waiving moral principles. Part of that persuasion is pressure, is struggle, is strike, is hopefully, I would think, by non-violent means. But ultimately, it can be by violent means too. I mean, there is no... One thing I believe that what is divine in the human is that we do not submit to injustice. And that we always find a way and a means to fight back. Even the weakest, the most disorganized, the least, sort of, as you said, the people who matter. It is not a question of persuading the people who matter. It is a question of making the people who matter do what is right. And that will take struggles. I mean, again, if you leave human rights completely out and talk about democracy or talk about constitutionalism or whatever it is something that we have to struggle to realize and to build on. If human rights is part of that discourse and will take us forward, we will keep it for what it does, not expecting it to do everything. If it doesn't, it will be discarded. I mean, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with Tomorrow morning, waking up, finding the word term human rights have been deleted from every document or textbook, fine. The idea remains, whatever we call it.
We have not talked about the secular. It was on the title. And obviously, this is a concept which has been the key to your work, both of you. You say that you need a secular state, a religiously neutral secular state, in order to live a good life as a Muslim. Obviously, you have developed a very different conception of what the secular, historically, how it has been formed. Maybe somebody from the floor will bring back some of these questions. But anyhow, let's open up the floor now. Those of you who would like to raise questions or comments, please, there are 2 microphones on the side, and please use them. So please, you can start with your questions. Then there's a microphone right there.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Steve Sawmill. I help to coordinate an interfaith group in the DC area. And I'd like to ask you, as a pragmatic optimist, and looking at Gaza and the human rights in Gaza, how do you see progress being made with the Netanyahu government, with the position that it takes? I look at this and I'm kind of pessimistic, although I'd like to see a ray of hope, and with the Obama administration trying, but it looks kind of bleak to me.
Okay. I think that's to me. Briefly, I would say, thinking of Iran, I know it's not what you are asking, but I'm sure that a few months ago, people would have been as despondent and as pessimistic about Iran. And yet, all along, there have been something brewing there that has suddenly transformed our understanding of the potential and the possibilities of what can happen in Iran. The same is true about the West Bank and Gaza, or Gaza in particular. Meaning that so long as, my emphasis on self-determination and the human as the agent of change, so long as people like yourself or others who are willing to push the issue and to stand for justice and what is right and what is just, it will come about. We have to believe that. That is what I mean, that I need to believe that it is possible to make the difference we need to have. And whether it is Gaza or Sudan or anywhere else, where I'm from Sudan, by the way, whatever it is, that the question is people making moral choices and standing by them to make the difference we need to have. If you are to say that this never worked before in human history, I think we will not be fair. Is to say that it always worked easily and fast, it will also be unrealistic. But whatever it is, that is where it has to be. Americans have to be confronted with the challenge of the double standard and the hypocrisy of what they are saying and doing about Gaza and what they are saying and doing about Afghanistan and what they did and still do with Iraq. These contradictions are what citizens have to face each other with. And that will go to Gaza too. Gaza is just an instance, a very tragic and very severe instance of injustice, of oppression, of inhumanity. But there are people who are struggling to make a difference, and I think it will come about. There are Israelis as well as others who are doing this, and that's how it goes. I don't know if it is not, I can't promise a time frame, I can't promise what it will be, but I cannot afford to say it cannot be helped.
Talal, will it come about? Which kind of pressure is necessary to the people that matter?
As far as I can see, the United States has such a firm connection with Israel that there's no, at least I don't see anything in the offing now, absolutely none. I don't see any moves that are significant beyond words, I'm afraid. So sad though that is, and tragic though that is, it's not something that is going to be resolved. And in any case, you and I would agree that it's not something that requires, as it were, the language of human rights, because
No.
it isn't. You know.
No.
If I might just say, and I'll sit down, the alliance idea with Israel,
Yes.
I think unlike with Clinton, with Obama, you have a standing up to Israel. And
I hope
it's-
so. I hope so. But there are, the thing that worries here. We're straying, but still, am I talking? Yes.
No, you better find
It's
find-
here that I beg your pardon. You
Hold
see.
it in your hand. Hold this one.
No wonder I'm not a wholehearted supporter. But I mean, the structure of interests is so powerful. It's not just a matter of one person. In my view, this is evident even in the debate now on healthcare. It must be evident to so many people. And that is that, the structure of interests and of government. By the way, Congress is also part of the state. It's the legislature, not just, as it were, the executive. And there the permeation of the political and the state is very close and difficult to disentangle. But anyway, so I think it's very difficult to see a resolution. I hope that something will happen. But I can't claim that it's a very strong hope that it will happen. Anyway, it's not really.
Let's collect two questions here on the side, and so please.
Okay, let's go back to the secularism that you mentioned. That was the title, and we just briefly touched. I'm just wondering, when you're talking that separation of the institution of the government and institution of the religion, and you meant that Sharia law separation, how does it possibly, you want to formalize it and do it? Because that is an Islamic country, all have this question. Let's take this country. We do have in the Bible two implications about the abortion and the gay, not law, just having that one. And this country, a very secular country, is struggling for, decades on that one, and the president would be elected, or the senators and all of them, that what is their position on that one. Coming to Islamic, that we do have the main production of the Islamic civilization is law. And anyway, although it's the understanding of the people from the religion, I do know that one, but the people think that is the religion. And in a religion that you do have, for all the detail, you have the law. Even in my country, I believe in more Muslim country, when you want to build the building, it depends, you have to consider that which direction your toilet should be. So you, even in the, when you're going to get the permit, you can't get the permit if the toilet is not toward the Mecca, should not be. So I'm just wondering, how do you want, what's the formulation that you want to separate it? If the government is a very secular government.
If you could please
be
as brief as
if the
possible.
secular government, how they want to put secular law and what is the secular law, and how they want to implement with having so many law in the Sharia that's becoming part of the society in every aspect of the belief system of the people.
Thank you. Let's gather another question, because otherwise we won't have the opportunity for everybody.
Assalamu alaikum. Roshan Iqbal is a doctoral student in Islamic Studies. My question is to Dr. An-Naim. As I understand it, there is a when and if there is a tension between Sharia and human rights, you would decide that tension towards you would decide for human rights. To take a crass example, if we took slavery, you would, if the people in a Muslim country decided that slavery was okay, you would say no, human rights trumps Sharia. But then how does that not cut against your self-determining human that you have? So it seems that the self-determining human is limited by how you describe human rights. And then that goes back to how Dr. Talal's talk yesterday, where this human rights has been determined by a Western male man. But that is not just it. It's not just a Western male man. Behind it is a capitalist. And there are certain reasons why these rules and these laws are put into being. So I would like you to speak a little bit about that. And also, when you talk about the self-determining human, I think you do not think about how there is structural injustice. And this self-determining human actually is unable to do anything. So you give too much onus to the ability for someone to have, these people to have self-determination. While on the ground, if we look at the reality, I mean, in countries like, for example, Pakistan, 20 families are ruling that country. People cannot self-determine. And I think creating this self-determination, which is a very nice sort of like luminous idea, is actually a straw man. I mean, it just deflects from the problem. So I just wanted to...
Okay, so you have the two questions on Sharia.
Okay. On the first question, I don't think that this country is a secular country. The United States is not a secular country. The United States government and the structures of governance and tries to be, but the people are not. People are profoundly religious. And therefore, the experience of the United States in negotiating precisely the First Amendment, I mean, the notion of separation of religion and the state, and the question of freedom of exercise of religion, that is the crux of the matter. It is something that American courts, American legislatures, American administrations are constantly struggling with how to make it work, but it is a workable formula. That is a formula that we can work with, although it's never going to be finally and conclusively decided once and for all. So for me, the question becomes, what do we need to have in terms of institutions or constitutional understandings that gives us the space of what I was talking about paradox and mediation of paradox. I do have some work on the notion of the interdependence of religion, secularism, and human rights. And my argument there is that each of the two needs the third one. That is, religion needs human rights and the secular. The secular needs religion and human rights, and so on. So a tripartite interdependence. So for me, religion is never to be taken out of the formula. I wouldn't stand for a secular state that would deny my right to be the Muslim I choose to be. When you say that there are so many aspects about Sharia which permeate every aspect of our life, true. The example of the toilet may not have been quite instructive, but yes, that, walking into a room, out of a room. But these have nothing to do with law or state functions. These are, in fact, in the book I talk about what I call the liberating function of Sharia. Sharia is not about, as Talal rightly said, it's not about cutting hands or stoning adulterers. It's about the many ways in which we are encouraged to be alert, to be reflective, to be, to seek to cleanse ourselves, to improve our moral standing, and so on. So all of those aspects about Sharia remain and will remain for Muslims to work with. It is just introducing it into state institutions that is problematic. That's my point. On the point about the question about human rights and Sharia, it is not true that I would ever uphold human rights over Sharia as such. I never said that anywhere, and I wouldn't defend it. The point is that human rights is a human construct. Sharia is a human construct. There are problems with both of them. And for me, the question is, therefore, I have to mediate, again, that paradox. Slavery is not bad because human rights says so. Slavery is bad and untenable from an Islamic point of view. So for me, as a Muslim, I need to make an argument about the untenability of slavery so that we can change our methodology and understanding of Sharia, not only as a matter of secular law, but not because human rights says so. What is human rights after all? And Talal is right, of course, that the laws and the institutions and the courts are all part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution, that it doesn't have to be that way. That courts have been, in this country, have been enforcing slavery laws, segregation laws. Now the same courts are doing something completely opposite, enforcing civil rights sort of legislation. So it is not the courts, it is what we make of them. It is not the law, it is what we make of it. And therefore, the question that you put to me about, it is not just simply automatic Sharia over human rights, human rights wins. It's a question of, if I cannot find an Islamic argument for a position, I would not hold it. Because I am a Muslim more than I am a human rights advocate. Being a Muslim defines who I am in more essence and more permanence than being a human rights advocate. A human rights advocate is a means to being a good Muslim, not a substitute for being a good Muslim. About the structural injustice, yes. And this has been historically true. But what to do? To me, the question is not just simply to, it is not just simply to identify what the problem is to come up with a strategy for fighting back, for a struggle. The notion of self-determination is not a panacea, again. It is not a magic word that we, self-determination and you stand up self-determining. It is not that. Let me put it this way. I don't think that there is any human being anywhere who is utterly and totally non-self-determining, nor is there a human person anywhere who is completely and totally self-determining. It is a process. It is a struggle. To believe in my ability to be self-determining is part of the struggle to make it happen. Not that it makes it happen because I believe it. I don't know if that helps.